Now I'd like to turn it over to Jenny Cole-Mossman, Technical Expert Lead with JBS International, to kick off the webinar.
We just wanted to do just a really quick opening remark and thank our presenters today. Currently, JBS is working with about 10 grantees that are serving tribal communities for the Office for Victims of Crime, working with our Youngest Victims grant. And some of the things that we are doing with those tribal grantees is just helping to create opportunities to collaborate with local leaders, including involvement in key tribal structures, such as cultural committees that are often utilized to form support services. We're also magnifying the role of grandfamilies and elders in informing victim services, including their involvement in tribal structures, and leading to the development and dissemination of locally developed outreach and engagement strategies and tools, such as therapeutic and culturally responsive activity resource boxes and resiliency building children's books. So those are some of the things that we are doing right now, and I apologize. I am not the one working on those grants, so I'm reading someone else's notes, but I know that some of those grantees are on the call today, and we wanted to thank them for joining us as well. So I'll turn it back over to GU.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of JBS and the Victim of Crime Act grantees for your interest and for joining us today for this webinar. We're sharing a resource that we jointly developed with NICWA, who you're going to hear from today, last year. And it is a toolkit for serving American Indian, Alaska Native grandfamilies. If you go to the next slide, I will tell you a little bit about Generations United. We have a national center on grandfamilies that we've had now for over 20 years. And we're guided by grand voices like Robin Wynn Tiger, who you're going to hear from today. They're a network of caregiver advocates who are raising children when their parents can't, and they represent the majority of states and 11 tribes, about 70 of them around the country. And all of our work really is guided by them. We also lead an advisory group of organizations, caregivers, youth that really also inform all of our work, and we try to coordinate with them. We conduct federal advocacy. We provide quite a bit of training and technical assistance. And we do a number of publications like this toolkit that we're sharing with you all today. Next slide, please. So here's the toolkit, and there's a link, back one, please. Here's the toolkit and the link to where you can get it, and you will get these slides after our presentation today. And it's available there for free download and dissemination. The lead author was the National Indian Child Welfare Association, NICWA, who we have partnered with before and since, and are just a tremendous resource. And I know you're going to value hearing from them very shortly. As I said, it's really a tool to give agencies a better understanding and better equip them to serve grandfamilies that are American Indian, Alaska Native. We also have a toolkit for African American grandfamilies, for serving African American grandfamilies, Black grandfamilies, that we released at the same time. And this year we're creating a parallel toolkit for serving Latino grandfamilies, and that's coming this fall. Next slide, please. Really, the goal of all of these toolkits is to raise cultural awareness and then provide resources. So if you're like me, you know, I'm a woman in her mid-50s who was was educated in public schools, and I didn't get any kind of education about American Indians. So I think there are a lot of us out there, and sadly, a lot of us that are much younger than me too. So this is really to try to provide that historical context and a better understanding, and then a better way to serve the families. If you go to the next slide. We started with American Indian, Alaska Native, and African American or Black grandfamilies because they are the populations that are most disproportionately represented in foster care and in kinship foster care and in grandfamilies in general. These numbers, I think, are a reflection of the challenges and the many cultural strengths of the population that really both groups, both African Americans and American Indian, really rely on kin, value extended family. So the data is a reflection of all of that, but it's also a reflection of what you'll see on the next slide, which are a lot of systemic and cultural challenges that the families face. Next slide, please. The parental causal factors. So grandfamilies, and I should explain that we use that term interchangeably with kinship families to mean grandparents, other relatives, and close family friends who raise children when parents can't. And the causal factors that create these families usually lead with substance use. That's usually the number one reason, although we don't have hard data on it. There's also incarceration, adverse immigration actions. There's all kinds of factors. But many of the factors that cause these families to come together disproportionately impact American Indian, Alaska Native, as you can see on this chart. And of course, most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, which really hit American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Black Americans much harder than the white population. So it is my pleasure. Well, let me end here with the next slide, which to let you know that, and it is my pleasure to share that grandfamilies have many strengths. So we really need to keep this in mind. And this cuts across all the cultural and ethnic groups, that when children can stay with kin, with family, with people who love them and know them, they thrive. I mean, it's essentially common sense, but there's decades of research behind it as well. And all of this states is equally true for American Indian, Alaska Native grandfamilies. And it's my privilege to turn it over right now to Nikwa, who really were the primary author of this toolkit and who can share all their expertise, or at least a lot of their expertise today with you. I believe I'm turning it to Alexis, is that right? And I will let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Anna. So my name is Alexis Contreras, and I'm a research assistant at the National Indian Child Welfare Association. And I'm also a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round, which is a tribe that's about an hour southwest of Portland, Oregon, where Nikwa is located. So it's just right here in the Northwest. And can we go to the next slide? And so I work at the National Indian Child Welfare Association with my co-presenter, Terry Cross, who is also going to introduce himself in just a minute. Terry is also the founder and our senior advisor at NICWA. And at NICWA, we do a lot of different work that supports the health, safety, and spiritual strength of Native children across a broad continuum of their lives. So we really think of child welfare services as very broadly to include things like basic needs, prevention, things that all children need. So we really think of it very broadly in that sense. We support tribes in building capacity to prevent and respond to child abuse and neglect. So we provide training and technical assistance to tribes, also states and counties if they request it as well. We do a lot of training around the Indian Child Welfare Act, as well as in-home services around working with substance abusing families, and also positive Indian parenting, which is one of our most popular trainings. So we also do a lot of work around policy and advocacy for policies that are going to affect tribes and Native children and have impacts for good outcomes with Native children. So I'll go ahead and give it away to Terry for the next slide.
Thank you, Alexis. You'd think after all this time I'd have the mute button down. So I want to just give a snapshot of some of the history that impacts our families. And you see here the stretches from what's known as the colonial period to today, the nation to nation period. I want to point back to even before the colonial period, what we refer to as the pre-colonial period, where the extended family was the core of our culture, and that continues to this day. Historically, in our tribal languages, there was no word for orphan because it simply did not occur that people were taken care of in their by their relatives if there was a need for that. There's also historically no evidence of child abuse and neglect being an issue other than strong taboos against hurting children and strong cultural teachings about meeting the needs of children. So for example, I'm a citizen of the Seneca Nation. I'm a member of the Bear Clan. My family's from the Allegheny Reservation, which is just southwest of Buffalo, New York. So my Seneca name is Hanagano. It means the one who watches out over water. And one of the teachings in our tribal longhouse is that if you see a child in need and you don't respond to the need, the creator is saddened. And that's a big offense in our territory. So the traditional teachings and ways support our children and families. And I want to point out that the removal period, the allotment period, the reorganization, termination, this is 140 years, about 7 generations of oppression. And it's only been in the last 40 years or so, since about 1968, that we've been able to, under federal laws, renew, reclaim, and remember who we are as tribal people and implement that in the form of our child welfare services. Next slide.
So we really want to help understand the history of Native family separation. So you saw that kind of snapshot of these hundreds of years of policies that were put in place to separate families. And starting with, we just wanted to highlight a few of those here. And the boarding schools and assimilation is really one that had very devastating effects on our Native communities. So the boarding school era, which started around the 1870s, was really a time when hundreds of thousands of children were taken from their homes, often by force, forced to go into these military type schools where they experienced harsh treatment, where there was physical and sexual abuse that was just rampant. Punishment for speaking their own language, punishment for practicing their cultures. So very harsh treatment that these children were experiencing in these schools. And as we already know, but people around the world are seeing now just the amount of children that did not survive these schools is being seen. And this was really this kind of concept of killing the Indian and saving the man. And so if we take these kids away from their homes and teach them how to assimilate into our culture, into the mainstream culture, this was that idea. And so assimilation, even after the boarding schools, the boarding school era, around the 1970s began to kind of die out. There was the relocation program, which was, and also termination of tribes. And so they were terminating tribes. My tribe is actually a tribe that was terminated and reinstated, and sending Native people all around the country to different cities and kind of just dropping them there and having them go into just programs, again, with this idea of assimilation. My grandma was, when my grandma was moved to San Francisco under the relocation program and, started her family there during that program. So and also my great grandpa went to a boarding school that was right here in Oregon, Chemawa, that's actually still running, where, he ran away all the time and was taken back all the time as well. So this kind of children being taken and removed from their homes, this continued even after boarding schools, even after the relocation. And after this, during the 1970s was kind of this era where there's the adoption project, the Indian adoption project, where they're again removing children from homes. And it was said to be about maybe 25 to even 35% of all Native children were removed and placed into white families, often coerced into giving up their children. So just really, this continues again, and we see it in the child welfare system. So this kind of, when we talk about historical trauma and unresolved grief and loss, we're really talking about that collective grief that Native communities share over all of these hundreds of years of policies that have been put in place to separate families. And the generational impact, you heard Terry say that it was 7 generations. So these generations of children who are growing up without their needs being met, without parents and without that love and nurture from their parents who loved and nurtured them and loved them. So this really had an effect on children, if they come back to their communities, adults now, and not understanding how to hunt and provide for their families, or how to, when is the good time to get berries, or whatever the roles of their community are, and not knowing those and not understanding them and not being useful in their communities. And so you get a lot of these children who go with unmet needs and then turning into parents with unmet needs. And so we really need to, as service providers, understand and acknowledge this history, and that that there's current discrimination, that there's still discrimination that exists in these systems. And that's really an important concept for service providers to know, especially to understand just why maybe a Native family is not trusting of services. There's a lot of distrust when it comes to the federal government with Native people. And so it's really important for people to not make assumptions if you're service providers, but to understand that you may have to work a little bit harder. You may have to work harder to gain trust of families. And next slide.
Thank you, Alexis. I want to revisit this idea of the boarding school and relate it to the generations of adverse childhood experiences that we call ACEs today, that originate in this historical trauma. And some think about this as being a long time ago, and it certainly started a long time ago. It started in 1819 with something called the Civilization Fund. And the Civilization Fund, I call it the first faith-based initiative. It gave grants to churches to save and civilize the Indian. And it established over 500 church boarding schools and orphanages. And on my own reservation, the Thomas Indian School and also the Quaker Indian School were 2 of those that were funded by the federal government under the Civilization Fund. In 1876, the federal system of boarding schools began, and as Alexis mentioned, the official federal policy was kill the Indian, save the man. And one of the reasons we wanted to emphasize here, and we've put the link to the Boarding School Healing Coalition here. We've heard in the news just recently, now the total number of graves found is around 1,500 at only 3 schools in Canada and in the beginning now in the US. And at NICWA, we estimate, if you think of those three schools as just a tip of the iceberg, where there were over 500 schools in the US alone and another 250, I think, in Canada. We're estimating that the number will go into the hundreds of thousands by the time we learn the true story here. What is so important for us in this toolkit is to have people understand the impact of this time and to understand how important it is to preserve families and to help our children grow strong in their culture and to recover in this intergenerational loss and grief that is so pervasive across. And we focus on the boarding school, but it's just one of the aspects of that history. Next slide, please.
And so one thing to remember is that Native cultures, nations, and people are very diverse. There are, I'm blanking on the number, 573 federally recognized tribes. And so that number could be a lot more because there are tribes that are not recognized still. There are some state recognized tribes as well. And all of these tribes have different cultures, languages, ways of life that can be very different. So we're just going to share here in this slide some common Indigenous cultural traits, things to remember, and like around general communication and values. So first, language may not be English. I especially see this like in Alaska, working with Alaska Natives. Many people, English is not their first language that they're learning. And that may be true around the country as well. But I just was thinking of Alaska in general because I know a lot of people who English is their second language. So they may need more time to even translate in their head. The languages are very different. Many languages have words around emotion and relationships that are just not easily translated into English. And so they just understanding that time needs to be made to allow for maybe that translation. They may speak more slowly and indirectly. It might be more common to hear a story rather than like facts, or when you're asking a question, because a story shows more context and you get the context rather than just the facts of your answer, or a straightforward answer, direct answer. Many tribes modest and reserved. So you do see this, of course, like as we said, many tribes are different, but a lot of them hold this as a value. Listening and being more reserved and taking their time to respond and being thoughtful. So also things like interrupting during a conversation or providing advice on what others should do can be considered rude, as well as making eye contact, too much eye contact. And sometimes as social workers or other people who are working directly with families, we've been taught and we've learned that we look at the person, we look them in the eye, that shows them respect, it shows them that we're listening, but it might make people in Native communities, sometimes it might make them uncomfortable, or they might look off to the side when they're talking. So just understanding these cultural traits and differences when you're entering homes and being respectful of that. Some of the shared values are respect for elders. They often hold a lot of experience of knowledge and of the ways of cultures. And so they're often respected. When I know sometimes you're at an event where there's families involved and the kids eat first. Like they always serve the kids first. Well, in Native communities, our elders eat first. And oftentimes you'll see kids going up and getting a plate and making it for their elders. If we're at the longhouse and they're serving a meal, my son will go and get a plate for his grandma or his aunties and uncles. So it's just a sign of respect for our elders. We take care of them. Wisdom over dry facts and data. So this is, again, kind of similar to what I was talking about with the kind of the storytelling and the context. Facts and data in mainstream culture, we're taught that that is what is important. Experts, degrees, those are the things that are important. Whereas in Native cultures, experience is really important, knowledge, the context. So how these things relate to each other, those things are just as important or more important in Native cultures. The view of times in terms of cycles. So again, not in terms when I'm asking my elder for asking how they do something, you might get a story about when is the time, or you might get a story that doesn't have to do with what it actually is. I'm asking my question, but you have to understand the cycle and the context. So a lot of times we view time in more of like a circle, a cycle. And things happen in patterns and cycles, and we don't think of times very linear in a line. Also, wide kinship networks. A lot of times you've heard the saying, like, it takes a village to raise a child. That's very true in a lot of Native cultures and communities. Our kinship networks are very important to us. Extended family is very important. And like I consider my cousins, those are my sisters and my brothers. That's how important our relationship is. And so we don't think of things as like the nuclear family. When we're thinking of family, we have a big extended family, and those are our big networks that we can also pull from, and we have strength that we can pull from. And then prioritizing the extended family over other commitments. So it may be that an appointment was made, maybe you have an appointment made and they cancel the last minute because something comes up with, they need to take grandma to an appointment. Maybe grandma has to go to an appointment. So those things take priority. Family needs would take priority over other commitments. And so those are just some values that we wanted to share today. Next slide.
So I want to give some examples of these things that Alexis was talking about. And one example, when I got finished with graduate school and went home to Allegheny to work, I was working for a school district as a school social worker. And part of the rule of one of the policies of the school is that if I was on work time, even if I was driving my own car, I couldn't give people a ride in my car. Well, on my reservation, people walk a lot. And if you don't stop to help, you're considered to be aloof or better than other people. And so I was constantly violating the policies of my employer because I had a higher calling. I would, if I saw one of our elders on the corner and I didn't stop and check and see how they're doing and visit for a few minutes, I would be considered as rude. So, and my one time my supervisor said, "Your car was parked in Nutty Watt's yard. Nettie Watt's an old lady. What are you doing there? She doesn't have any kids." And I said, well, if I don't maintain a good relationship with Nettie, then I'm not going to know about any of the children in her neighborhood and she has about 20 grandchildren in this school district. But it didn't matter. They only were concerned with the policies they had. And another example that I think of is that a good friend of mine in graduate school had a traditional role in his family, a ceremonial role at the Yakama Nation when in the first salmon ceremony. And it was finals time at just before spring break. And he told the professor he had to go home and fish. And his professor said, you don't get to go fishing. You've got to study. You got to turn in your papers on time, Of course, he went home because he was the person who had to perform the ceremony for the first fish, because if you don't do that ceremony, the fish won't return the next year. So it's just a different and higher priority that we have to pay attention to. And our job can be much more effective in working with families if we understand those cultural differences and if we help nurture the cultural identity of the young people and the families that we work with. Things just as simple as being able to offer a greeting or introducing yourself in your language is so empowering to our young people. Next slide.
So here's our first poll question. How are you engaging American Indian, Alaska Native grandfamily caregivers in the design and implementation of your services? So please check all that apply. Are you doing some hiring and training as peer supports, inviting as board or advisory group members, engaging through focus groups, asking satisfaction through surveys or town halls? Currently not engaging, but want to. And so if you'll just take a minute and respond to the poll question. We'll give everyone some time to respond. And great. So it looks like about 30% of you are doing some hiring and training as peer supports. 20% are doing some engaging through focus groups. And then about 50% are currently not engaging but want to. And so this is maybe a great webinar for you to be joining to kind of get some ideas about that. Thank you. Next slide. And so we wanted to talk a little bit with Robin Wind, who was one of our Grand Voice members, and she's here to share with us a little bit today. I have some questions, and we're gonna kind of just have some conversation with her. Thank you, Robin. You have really a great and special perspective as a caregiver to your grandson, and also as a professional who works with other kinship families as well. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Robin Wind Tiger. I live on the Muskogee Creek Reservation in Oklahoma. I am a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm also eligible for citizenship with the Cherokee Nation. I have 2 boys and I have 4 grandchildren, 3 are living. And let's see, 2013, I became a relative caregiver for my grandson, my youngest grandchild. And I have worked in Indian child welfare for both the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation for about 15 years, and just recently decided that I need a break. So I'm caregiving full time right now.
That's wonderful. I'm glad that you can be there for your family. and in that way. So one of the keys to operating effective kinship programs and supports is authentically engaging voices of kinship care providers. How can programs authentically engage American Indian or Alaska Native grandfamilies? And what are some of those practices that you've seen?
Sure. So I think one of the most important things, or the first thing to do, is to ensure families have a seat at the table, because we are certainly the experts on our family dynamics and can provide information helpful to the process. We know what familial resources we have, what barriers we might face. And, you can rightly assume that we will do anything for our grandchildren, but it's great to keep us engaged. Please be open and honest about the process and barriers. Many tribal citizens find it difficult to trust agencies, as you've heard previously. So know what the families you work with may not know that the families you work with may not understand your process and will need help with that. We often have barriers such as, English as a second language, literacy, financial issues, time management, and of course, distrust. And these barriers may need to be addressed. Understand historical trauma. It may help your workers understand why we do the things we do. Please don't make promises you can't keep. Please don't tell us, if we don't already understand the process, that the judge is going to grant, an adoption tomorrow, if that's not going to happen, for sure, because you never know what's going to happen. Effective and authentic engagement, of course, like I've just mentioned, is practice family engagement from the start. Consider using peer support, whether it be birth parents or kinship caregiver mentors. Having someone available who has been in our position is invaluable to families, and often we'll turn to those people for help if we're, not completely trusting, and we may not, our caseworkers. Address barriers. For example, if grandma seems to have trouble with literacy, could you maybe help her fill out forms or read important papers to her? Would your agency be willing to help with transportation or to facilitate video calls? Locate targeted, culturally appropriate services. Tribal offices can be a big help and often will have resources such as behavioral health or parenting services available. Train your staff about the importance of ICWA. Often caseworkers feel an ICWA case involves extra work and can often be less than helpful when it comes to family engagement. Train about historical trauma.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was a lot of great information. And I really like, just having that seat at the table, because maybe there is a family member that's, Robin, you were able to take your grandson in, but maybe there's a family member that can't do that, but they can still be sitting at the table and helping to make decisions and helping to connect to family, helping with that context, helping the parent to advocate or communicate with the workers. So thank you so much for what you shared. And then what have you found to be among of the greatest challenges for American Indian and Alaska Native grandfamilies? And what are some of the cultural strengths that have helped overcome some of those challenges?
I think one of the greatest challenges would be lack of resources for some of our families. Oftentimes we'll live out, in rural areas where we can't get back and forth to, the main center of town, or we don't have access to transportation to get there. Or maybe it could be that we just don't know of available resources. Another issue is, of course, not understanding the legal process. As workers in the field, we've been trained to know what an adjudication is, the process to obtain an attorney, what happens during a home study, what ICWA means, but grandfamilies may need help wading through all of those processes. Like I said, I've had a lot of experience before I got my grandson in foster care. And I had a problem, getting resources. I ended up having to do most of that myself. So, and I have, I have a lot of experience in that. So it's easy to understand that people who don't understand that this or have this is their first experience with a system may have issues with that. Sometimes we feel alone and frustrated and maybe, reluctant to ask for help because we might be afraid that the caseworker is going to take our baby if we ask for help. So there's that distrust again. So if you can offer support, if you see that maybe grandma looks a little harried or there's 25 things on her schedule this week, if you could offer some sort of support, that would be great. And that would also keep your placement from being blown. And at times workers may misinterpret, Terry and Alexis have already hit on this, but they may misinterpret or not understand cultural cues, such as eye contact or short, abrupt answers. We're not being rude or shady or apathetic, or it's not that we don't care. It's just the way we were raised. I've often heard some of our state workers say, well, that grandparent doesn't care. They don't answer the questions correctly, or they don't look at us, or and it's not that. We do love our grandchildren. We just have different cultural cues than others. I think as far as cultural strengths overcoming these challenges, we have been through so much as Native Americans, our communities have, and we're still here. So we're strong and resilient, and we tend to pull together and take care of our own. That's why we're still here. And that's also why you may find multiple generations living in one house. And it's also why finding culturally appropriate services is important. And as we discussed before, numbers are disproportionate regarding Native children in foster care, and you'll find an even greater number being cared for by children without formal arrangements. And this is certainly true for all cultures, and for us, caring for our elders and children is paramount to our tribes.
Thank you so much, Robin. And is there a program that you can think of that does an especially good job of serving American Indian and Alaska Native grandfamilies? And what do you think it is about that program that was special, or is there something that makes it really effective?
I think some of the best programs that I had that I was able to take advantage of were tribal services. Sometimes tribes have, I've worked for two of the largest tribes in the nation, and even we were stretched thin as far as staff. Sometimes it might take a little bit for you to get your email answered or a phone call back from tribes, and they may just have one person covering the whole country. But if you contact tribes and ask them what do they have available, or how they can help their citizens that you may be working with, that's the best route as far as I'm concerned. And also for me, CASA, our court-appointed special advocates, was really a wonderful help. I spent a month in the hospital with him at one point, and that CASA worker was able to really help with the issues that came up during that time. And also, of course, NICWA and Generations United provide excellent resources for training. I used to use that often with my staff, my new staff training. And if there's a resource that you need and they don't offer that, they can point you that way.
Thank you so much, Robin, for sharing and kind of just sharing your experience and your knowledge with us in this group. It's really important to know just what you can do, who you can ask, who are those people, and so I appreciate that your words today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Next slide.
And I want to add my thanks, Robin. Terrific. And not only thanks for helping us in this presentation today, but for the good work you do in your community and your family. I want to give, we have just a couple of minutes left before we jump into some questions, but we do want to highlight a few items from the regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act. And the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978 in response to national research that showed that 1 in every 4 American Indian children was in out-of-home care, 85 to 95% of them in non-Indian homes and institutions. There were literally American Indian communities where there were no children. And this, was a situation where it became very clear that our peoples were going to cease to exist if something wasn't done about it. So the ICWA was passed. It is now considered the gold standard of child welfare practice. And that's been documented in testimony after testimony to the Supreme Court, as well as in Congress, that every child should have what the Indian Child Welfare Act provides. It requires notice to the child's tribe. It allows the tribe to intervene in the child's case. It makes the tribe a full party, because as citizens of members of tribes, tribes have a interest in their citizens and their citizens' well-being. It allows the tribes and parents and the Indian custodian, and that may be a relative care provider, the right to petition the court to a county or state court to transition the case to tribal court. And it requires that efforts be made to prevent the breakup of Indian families or to reunify them if there's a placement. Most importantly, to our Grandfamilies conversation, it provides an order of preference for placements, starting with relatives. So the Grandfamilies play a significant role in the implementation of ICWA. Next slide, please.
And so ICWA applicability, is one thing that we get questions at NICWA at all the time. When does ICWA apply? And so ICWA does not apply to all children who racially identify as American Indian or Alaska Native. And so states and counties, they need to apply ICWA. It is not based on not a race-based law. It's based on a citizenship of a sovereign tribe. So your citizenship or membership of a sovereign tribe is what ICWA applies to. So it only applies to children who are under the age of 18, who are unmarried, a member of an Indian tribe, or eligible for membership of an Indian tribe, and is the biological child of a member of an Indian tribe. And so tribal enrollment is really determined by each tribe specifically. So a lot of tribes use blood quantum, and that's something that came, out of policies from the federal government, blood quantum. So like my tribe, for instance, they still use blood quantum as their eligibility standard for whether you're a member or not. Other tribes, some use lineal descendants from someone who's on the tribal roll. So I think that Tlingit and Haida does this. Cherokee Nation goes by lineal descendants. And then others might relationship to a tribal member who was descended from someone on the base roll. So that base roll they're talking about the membership roll when the tribe was first under the federal, Terry, I'm looking for the word, but when the federal government did kind of some of the policies around the Indian Reorganization Act, I guess the base role, they're talking about like the base enrollment role, so for the tribe. So each tribe is basically can make their own determination of the requirements. So that's their right to do as a sovereign nation. And so you have to understand. So you would just actually, thank you, Shirley. I think she just put self-determination policy in there. Thanks, Shirley. So just making sure that you're communicating with the tribe and their enrollment office to make sure that you're checking to see if ICWA does apply to the children that you work with. And next slide.
Yeah, and I think we'll just summarize the next couple of slides and jump, because we want to jump to questions. So the really important thing is to identify children it's eligible for ICWA when you can. So ask the family and ask the people who know the family, fill out the family tree. There's a process to in the notification process to check, to record the lineage. And it's important to do your research, compile that research, and reach out. But as I said, the Indian Child Welfare Act is considered the gold standard of practice. So you won't go wrong by following the act for any child until you know for sure whether the law actually applies to them. So next slide.
So some recommendations. Robin talked about authentically engaging families and having a seat at the table, really important. So thank you for that. Also, something that states and other organizations can do is collect data on racial disparities. Plan for that. If you know that that's something that is happening in your state or county. Developing lists of culturally competent Native or therapists, counselors, and other providers. So knowing who's in your community and who you can call up. Providing comprehensive trainings and written materials on ICWA's requirements. There's lots of resources out there. We have, we have some materials on our website that you can definitely check out on our NICWA website. And then, not requiring families to accept services that are not culturally appropriate. And I think Robin also touched on this too. There's tribes that have their own services that you could maybe tap into. Again, under like relocation, there was lots of families that moved all over the country. And so you see, there's some tribes in Oregon that serve Alaska Native children within their services. So maybe there's a tribe that serves other children that are in the location or the area. And then using inclusive language and images in your materials. And so again, Robin touched on this as well. So using that inclusive language and those images so that they can see themselves, that they have a little bit more trust, maybe not limiting parents. And we have another poll question. Which of these action steps will you first prioritize in your community? So we have authentically engaging American Indian, Alaska Native grandfamilies, collecting data on racial disparities, conducting assessment of inequities, and creating a plan for addressing. Developing lists of culturally competent American Indian, Alaska Native therapists, counselors, and other providers. Providing comprehensive trainings and written materials on ICWA's requirements. Providing comprehensive trainings and written materials. Oh, that was a repeat. Ensuring that families don't have to accept services that are not culturally appropriate. And using inclusive language and American Indian and Alaska Native images and materials. So what is an action step that you can take? What would be the first step that you could prioritize in your community? Wow, 100% said that ensuring families don't have to accept services that are not culturally appropriate. So that's great. We know that culturally appropriate services are really important.
So we want to just highlight some of the resources that are available, and in particular, next slide, there's a great culture card. If you're not familiar with this, it's a little pocket card. It folds out into a 11 by 17 pack, little piece of paper that is packed with information, developed by Andy Hunt at SAMHSA for emergency responders who are going into tribal communities. Next slide. And Alexis, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, and of course, we'd love for you to check out our American Indian and Alaska Native Grandfamilies Toolkit. It was really great getting to work with Generations United and Robin Wind in the creation of this toolkit. So you can find it on the Generations United website. You can find it on NICWA's website. And I think we also have, it's a free download. There may also be hard copies if people are interested, I think, if that's right, Anna. I know we have some at NICWA. And thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you all for your presentation. We just have one quick question. I know we're running out of time, but one of the participants did ask if any of the panelists are familiar with agencies that provide support groups for American Indian and Alaska Native Grandfamilies or respite programs, or where they can find that information.
Checking with your own local tribes is important. Usually the behavioral health department, if there's a Grandfamily support group, it's often done in partnership with with child welfare. Robin, do you know if any there in Oklahoma?
I can say that several of the tribes have support groups for foster parents, and some of them have branched off to do support groups for, relative kinship caregivers. There's one in Okmulgee County, I know that, but it would be a great idea to contact your local tribe and see if maybe they offer that through their Indian Child Welfare Program, like Terry said.
And I'll add that in chapter 6 of the toolkit, there's a section on aging services, and a lot of area agencies on aging also provide these kind of services like support groups, primarily to those age 55 and older. But there are a special National Family Caregiver Support Program that's for tribes, but also American Indians access other area agencies on aging as well. So that could be a resource too.
And urban Indian organizations often provide support groups as well. Here in Portland, the Native American Youth and Family Center provides support groups for relative care providers and foster parents. Great.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. We are unfortunately out of time, but just a couple of quick reminders to please complete the post-survey webinar you received from SurveyMonkey after the webinar. The webinar recording along with presentation slides will be distributed within the coming weeks. And then on the slide there, you'll see we have 2 upcoming webinars in July, one from NACOA and the second from the Frameworks Institute. So please look out for announcements about that. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.